In which we're focusing on the theme of sounds from beyond with reference to the music and the life and the legacy of our late esteemed colleague, friend, partner, icon, musical sojourner, the late Zim Ngqawana. And I'd like to thank the Durban International Film Festival and the isiPethu program for recognizing the significance of this being the decade after we lost Zim to this world, but we'll be speaking a lot about his ongoing legacy and the way his work continues to inspire new generations of musicians and activists across the spectrum. So my name is Brett Piper. I'm based at Wits University in Johannesburg, and I've been asked to facilitate the session. And we have several colleagues with us who will be sharing their experiences of working with Zim during his lifetime, but also taking his work forward. And I'm delighted to introduce as our first speaker someone who knew him from the 1970s already. But before I do that, I'm going to just acknowledge everyone who's made today's session possible. So to start with, the Isipetu program at the Durban International Film Festival has partnered with the following three organizations to present the session. And the first is the Zimology Institute, and we're delighted and honored to have Sarah Davids with us on the panel, who will speak to the work of the Zimology Institute into the future. We also have the support of Kumisa, and we like to thank Spamandla Ngobo for his support. And of course, the Center for Jazz at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, which has played such a profound role in Zim's career, as well as so many other inspirational musicians, under the founding directorship of Professor Darius Brubeck, who's with us today. I'd also like to acknowledge other colleagues at UKZN, specifically Tuli Zama and Neil Gonzalez, and also at Wits University, my colleague, Dr. Andile Khumalo. So we're going to have a series of inputs over the next hour or so from the speakers on the panel. We're going to share short video and photographic clips where we can, and we're going to engage in a dialogue with one another in relation to the question that the festival has asked of us, and that is, what kind of role can filmmakers play in documenting and preserving the kind of legacy that musicians like Zim Ngqawana have left us? And it's a rich question, I think, in the South African setting specifically, because film was not only one of the spaces in which jazz was documented, but actually one of the primary vehicles by which the music came to this country. Those of us who are historians of the music know of the many anecdotes of musicians in the 40s and 50s going to the cinema and running from there to the rehearsal room in places like Sophia Town, and that the music was conveyed and appropriated in South Africa through a filmic medium. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that as well. So our first speaker today is a long-time fellow traveler and musician and an icon in his own right. I'm delighted to welcome McCoy Mrubata. And McCoy, will pass over to you first, please, to share your reflections. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, Zim Ngqawana. I met Zim, I think, in 1977, I thought initially it was 76, actually 1977. He had come, to a family thing in Cape Town and had heard, of McCoy, For some reason, I was known at a very young age because of my mom. My mother used to host musicians, back in the day, as you know, black people were not allowed into hotels. So traveling musicians, especially Gibson Kente, all these entourages, will be accommodated in the townships. So my mom will accommodate all these artists, and people, my place was known as Glo McCoy's place, and at the time, 76, that's when I started to pay penny whistle, and flute later. And I kind of got famous, and Zim had heard of McCoy. He came while I was with fellow musicians. We were practicing, and introduced himself, and we became friends. And we didn't have a phone at my house, but somehow we found way to speak to one another. While I was back in PE, we really became tight. And then the next visit was, 2 years later when he had joined Jonathan Butler's band. He came to my house again. I'll come to his hotel to Menenberg where he lived, and we kind of got tight, and the way initially Zim learned in music, was similar to the way I did, learning from the elders, like Winston Mankunku, Ezra Ngqawana, and I was fortunate enough, all those greats were around my neighborhood, Robert Sitole, similar with Zim, with the soul jazzman. And we're curious enough to learn to read music, and I will go to libraries when in Cape Town, and we'll swap books and stuff like that. And fast forward now, here in Johannesburg, when he got to opportunity to study in KZ, and I had already settled in Johannesburg, in the 90s. He'll come and stay with us, him and Lulu. It was great. Yeah, and Zim, what I like about him, especially when his career was now at its height, Zim was a super improviser. Not necessarily, I'm not talking about knowing the changes and all that. Zim will take a non-instrument horn, old gadget, and make it and incorporate it in his music. There's a story of Zim in Grahamstown, relayed by Paki, when he conducted the youth band, Standard Bank Youth Band. Paki Palia told us about a beautiful story where Zim, they were shopping in Grahamstown. Zim found this old radio, analog radio where it turned stations, They were puzzled. What's this about? And then came the time of the gig. There's a song Zim called Unomatotolo. Now Unomatotolo means radio, especially the old radio, analog, And then he'll get the young pianist to do an intro, and then took that radio into the mic and change the frequencies. People went crazy, And then another story of Zim being able to bring toyish instrument on stage is a video clip I saw in Switzerland 10 years ago when I went to play the Bird's Eye. Professor White says Zim, once again, during the day shopping, he found this valve flute, a toyish flute, And he didn't even practice, but, I tried to upload that video. I'll show it later, how Zim played that flute, with his young quartet, Ayanda Sikade, Duduzo, Shane Cooper, It was so beautiful, Zim he will drown you, with a few notes, he was something else. And of course, he played assortment, of strange instruments, a small, harmonica, and a different flute. So, and also, he didn't sing like, conventional singers. So those are the fond memories of Zim, beyond his other deepness, his philosophy, I like to concentrate on the simpler stuff, because that's how I am. I'm a simple musician. I never got the opportunity to study, but I studied with, informally with Winston, Ezra, Brabani, and whoever came to town, I would share questions. And of course, I was privileged also in Cape Town of learning from the late Brian Tusi when they were with Drive, and there were occasions whereby when they played at Goldfinger, Zim was in town, we'll go and listen to Drive, you know. And yeah, that's my bit about early Zim and a bit later.
Thanks so much for sharing that, McCoy. And I mean, a few really important things you've emphasized. This hunger to learn, firstly,
Yes.
kind of always creating knowledge where one is, whether one's in a formal education setting or not. And then it seems to extend into this ability to just absorb objects into his music, right?
Yes.
Objects that other people might not see as musically or sonically useful. There was a kind of mind that absorbed so many elements. Beautiful to hear you speak to that. And if you are able to share that clip, please do at some point with those of us in the room. So at this point, we're going to move to Darius. And I'm particularly grateful to Darius for drawing our attention to a clip on YouTube, which I'm now putting in the chat function here in the webinar for people to be able to access. We're going to play a very short excerpt. And this is of the ensemble that was formed when Zim was a student at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I think actually when it was still the old UN in the late 1980s, and a student of Darius's. And we're going to just view about 2 minutes of the clip. Now, apart from the 1980s hairstyles and recording technologies, it's very pixelated, and we don't have a lot of sound, but again, just to underscore the value as a historical document of sound and image on film in the work of memorialization and of education. We'd love to share that. So if I could ask our technical team to please play the clip, and then we'll have a dialogue.
We heard the students play in Detroit at the annual conference of the National Association of Jazz Educators.
Now at this time I'd like to take the pleasure of introducing the members of the Jazzanians. One of South Africa's young top drummers, Zim Ngqawana. Next to me is Zim Ngqawana on alto and flute. Then I've got very close friend of mine, Rick van Heerden on alto and tenor saxophone. Then on piano, it's none other than the beautiful Melvin Peters.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us, Darius, and over to you, please.
All right, well, I'm really happy to be here virtually, and because he didn't introduce himself, I'll say that's the famous Johnny Mqawana on trumpet, who was the leader of the Jazzanians, and they were all students at the University of Natal in 1988. But this is about Zim, and so I'm going to try to hit some highlights in his whole story, just pick out some themes and leave it to other people to dig more deeply into it. And I really enjoyed listening to McCoy. McCoy, I took a lot of notes on what you said.
Thank you.
Zim was born in 1959, let's not forget, and that is the year that changed everything in the jazz world. That was the year Ornette Coleman, to whom he's been compared sometimes, released The Shape of Jazz to Come. Dave Brubeck, my father, released the Time Out album that introduced Take 5 and odd time signatures to jazz in general. John Coltrane made his first album as leader, Giant Steps. Miles Davis, Kind of Blue. So in a way, if we rewind the tape to that spot, there was some kind of magic in the air, and that's when Zim was born, on what's more, on Christmas Day. McCoy has already filled in what I thought was maybe something very important and too easily left out of the story, and that was the community of New Brighton. And that was so important in the jazz world, and ultimately it was important to jazz education because it kind of launched us in the right direction, as I'll explain in a moment. I'm going to just quickly do a resume of Zim's career in terms of a wider concept, a theme of community. So that was the first community. That was a learning community for Zim. It was the Soul Jazzmen. It was also Aunt Ann, it's hard for me to say that correctly with my American accent, who taught flute at Rhodes University. And Zim very quickly learned to read music and master the basic skills of the flute as a Western instrument, but of course, modeled himself more on saxophone players, kind of the quintessential jazz instrument. McCoy dealt with that, so I'll move on to like the second community. Was a different kind of learning community. That was the University of Natal. And Lulu was already there in a kind of undefined capacity, but absolutely essential for us. Lulu was living with us. Zim was sent up with some money that was raised at Rhodes University, organized by Andrew Tracy, the former head of the International Library of African Music. Zim arrived. I hadn't met him before, I hadn't even heard of him, but I was just knocked out. This is someone who presented himself well, he spoke well, he played well, obviously had experience. And that's really what I needed in my program, were students who knew why they were there, right? Not yet those who came to find out what it was about. It was great to have some people who already knew that they wanted to improve in certain areas. And as soon as Zim and Lulu were there and we were starting classes, not long after that, Zim knocked on the door of my office and very powerfully and sincerely and simply said, Fea Faku deserves the same chance as I have. And I believed him, because whatever he said and whatever was said about him was always true. So got Fea and Lex Fuchane, who is now, very much a part of the Joburg scene, to come up. And we were all literally living together in a house, and then later in a flat, because at that time there was group areas, and none of the students could afford res, as it was university residence. So we were a kind of transplantation of the New Brighton community in that age peer group to Durban. Wow. And we had great times together, and it was building up to the Jazzanians, which is really what put formal jazz education on the map in South Africa. That clip that you saw was from CBS, which is an American national television network. As a result of that trip, Zim was offered a scholarship to Amherst University. It was partly funded by Max Roach, and also with some support from my parents. There were quite a few exchanges of letters between Zim and my mother and father, and someone named Juliet Gerlin, who was working on their staff at the time. So now he was kind of in a wider jazz community, going back and forth between Massachusetts and New York. He stayed with Max Roach when he was in New York. He stayed with my parents or Juliet when he was kind of in transit between, and he was on campus at Amherst. he went to a workshop in Sandpoint, Idaho, and to the annoyance of my parents, because you don't have time zones in South Africa, he didn't realize that he was phoning them at 2 o'clock in the morning to say that he had just met Wynton Marsalis and he was invited to, attend a further workshop. Suddenly, Zim's world now is transcontinental, isn't it? Because he's made these top-level connections, all people who were impressed with him enough to want to help him and to include him in their projects in some ways. Zim returns to South Africa with all those connections made and the opportunities they eventually led to, and going beyond kind of the academic and maybe top echelon world, he has to forge now an artistic identity. He becomes more Afrocentric. He also develops a form of presentation that is completely convincing because he's not, he's benefiting from the things that he's learned, but he's not simply replicating them. He's not just being like Cannonball, but not quite as good as Cannonball. He's being himself. Cannonball Adderley, for those who don't know, alto player. His quartet that I really love, if I were going to introduce anyone to Zim's music, I don't know if he would agree with this. I'm almost sure he wouldn't, but I would play the quartet with Andile Anana, Herbie Tswali, and Kevin Gibson. And that quartet in 1997, Herbie and Andile were just with Zim. They went as members of the quartet, and I brought Zim and Kevin Gibson with me as a member of Gathering Forces, which was kind of a world music project. So within the festival, you had Zim's quartet and you had my group, which featured Deepak Ram, the bansuri player. And in a sense, we were the main jazz component of that festival in 1997. And Kathy and I went to hear Zim's set, and it was just one of the best concerts I'd ever heard. And it was a very, very conscious kind of musical theater. You've, I think, all heard the Migrant Workers song. It was that era. He was using all of his horns. He was using a lot of percussion instruments, as McCoy mentioned. And there was always a kind of narrative arc to the performance. I'm going to jump ahead. I don't mean to monopolize, but I just think this will framework a lot of things. In between Zim's career is growing more internationally. There are big gaps in my knowledge of what Zim was doing in the States, although he was often there, and in Europe, in Germany, Switzerland. But our next big cooperative project was commissioned by Lincoln Center, Jazz at Lincoln Center, and that was part of a series called Let Freedom Swing. It had a very strong political message, and it was functioning as that because it was just before the second presidency of George W. Bush, for whom we can be grateful for the Iraq War and other disasters. And it was October. It was a month before people were actually going to vote. So Commission 2004, in our case, was the Lincoln Center people took speeches from Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, and they recruited Morgan Freeman to read them live to the audience, and Zim and I to orchestrated for the Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra. So that was a high point in my career and for Zim's. We did that. The next step was, as you know, when I say the next step, I mean in my relationship with Zim. You know, his life is continuing out there. He's doing other things. But very soon after that, it became possible to appoint Zim to staff at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, as it then became. This was difficult to pull off because he didn't have the highest level academic qualifications. It was hard to convince people who were looking at it as an academic post, but I kept lobbying on the basis that here you have an original artist who really speaks for you. You know, I introduced what I had, and I tried to encourage development here. Well, here is the development, right? But you can't expect Zim to function in the same way that I did, or that someone who's in the academic world. But we tried it out because at the time it was affordable, making a dual appointment. But Zim just felt it wasn't right for him. And I think this was very honorable on his part. There may be rumors that he was discharged. That's not true. He resigned because he was in a different space then. This was also around the time of getting the Zimology Institute started. He was saying things like jazz is dead. I disagree, but as far as he was concerned, it was like flogging a dead horse teaching kids jazz. Jazz wasn't going to be anything in 10 years. And he was playing sort of free anyway, which meant, well, what could he transmit except his philosophy? It wasn't about technique or theory or, you know, anything that we can transfer easily except through the means that he thought of, you know, the Zimology business. So he came to my office again, and this was not a confrontation. It was just a statement of fact. He said, you know, if I stay here, you want me to be just a saxophone teacher. Well, I could see that point of view. Just a saxophone teacher isn't the kind of reduction in status that he sort of didn't see what it could be to be a saxophone teacher. It's not just something. It could be all he wanted to be, but it required a lot that it required him to fit into a system he didn't fundamentally believe in. And so he didn't want to be just a saxophone teacher, and he didn't want to be giving exams to students and marking papers and teaching scales. So, you know, fine. I think it was our loss. I think there could in the future be a way of accommodating someone who is an artist and highly accomplished in any field without requiring them to. But anyway, it was a job. He didn't want to do the job. The last time I saw Zim was in 2011. So this is kind of where the story ends almost. Kathy and I were in Johannesburg. We were at the Ocean Basket in Rosebank Mall, thinking, gosh, it's too bad we don't have time to go all the way from the northern suburbs down to where Zim lives. We'd seen him last year, 2010 anyway, but it would be great to see Zim. By the time I looked up from the menu, Zim was standing in front of us, which was the kind of Zim magic that wasn't unusual. And we spent a wonderful afternoon together, in which one of the things he disclosed was that he had made a recording with some cats in New York. It was the absolute music that he always wanted to make. One of them was the pianist Matthew Shipp. I don't know who the others were, It's not impossible to find out, by the way. I've been researching this, but there isn't a definitive release as far as I know. Sarah may be able to throw some light on this. And his last words, in effect, to us were, "Oh, this music is so great, I could die happy." And sorry, Sarah, it's moving, but he literally used those words, and a few weeks later, he did. So that's my input.
Darius, thanks so much for sketching those phases of the Zim you knew, but I think it's really helpful in giving a structure to our conversation of filling in the life and the work, which are one and the same, of course. That's really, really great. Thank you. And I'm sure that as we go along, we're going to keep coming back to some of that framework. And if I may speak next, I'm going to actually pick up on that first community that you spoke about.
Right.
Because I think in the way that we tell the story of this music we call jazz, often, it's the big city lights that get the publicity, and it's the story of Johannesburg and Cape Town. But the particular significance for me, that Zim and Lulu and Feya and of course so many other icons that they were following were from New Brighton, is a good place to return to in this conversation. So I'm going to just share a couple of images that I'd like to share with you all. And here I have to say that I first met Zim in that second phase that you spoke about when he came back from the States. I was trying to remember, and I think it would probably be around 1991, so 30 years ago now. I was running as a young arts manager in Pretoria, a small jazz series. And then I've realized, McCoy, you and Darius, I had the joy of programming in that series in the Rendezvous Theatre. And it was in that context that I got to know Zim. He'd come back from the States. I remember visiting him at his flat in Hillbrow and already being struck by that consciousness that Darius spoke to. So here's a beautiful picture of the Jazzanians that's obviously taken a couple of years after the clip that Darius drew our attention to. Here, the late Sandile Shange is next to Johnny Mekwa. And my source for these images is someone who's come up in both McCoy's and Darius's narrative of the early phases, and that is the beautiful late Lulu Gonzana, who Darius has described, I think, so aptly as South Africa's house drummer. Certainly for much of the 80s and 90s, Lulu played with everyone and had an extraordinary reach. And I was interested what you said, Darius, about his role in actually also, kind of in a sense, pioneering the relationship between the New Brighton jazz community and the jazz program at the then University of Natal. So in 2005, I'd come back myself from studying in New York and was working on jazz-related topics. And Lulu asked me if I'd assist him to put together a book about his life. And so the images I'm sharing with you emerged from that process. In the end, there wasn't much at a narrative level that I had to go on in helping Lulu put together an account of his career. But it was when he shared his photo album with me that a life came into that process. And the images I'm sharing with you became part of an exhibition and a small essay in a catalog that I wrote for the sadly ill-fated Red Location Museum in New Brighton. But it takes us into the space that Lulu and Zim and Feya and others came from as one example of where this music has profoundly deep roots outside of the dominant narratives in South Africa. So from that same performance, which I understand to be in the then PE, I'm not sure about the venue, Lulu's not looking great in this shot, but it's a beautiful shot of Zim and Victor Masondo behind him. And this, as I said, was one of the extraordinary images that Lulu shared with me. This is Lulu outside their house in Funde Road, as a young teenager, already that penetrating stare that many of us know from him. And of course, it was a community in which music thrived, and there was an incredibly beautiful intergenerational process underway. So here's the young Lulu on the knee of the late George Tefumane with Bro Dudley Tito behind him. That's Big T Nsele with the sunglasses and Duke Makazi next to him in that small workshop behind the late Bro Dates' house in Avenue A in New Brighton. Again, important for us, I think, to place the music in these kinds of settings. And so here's the young Lulu playing maracas on the far left with the soul jazzmen at St. Stephen's Hall, probably sometime in the early 1970s. Big T is playing the drum in the middle. We've got Duke Makazi with his back to us. Just an extraordinary snapshot of the life of this music in communities like New Brighton in the 1970s. And the last of these images I thought to show today, this is a picture in which Lulu himself is visible on the far right, kind of standing head and shoulders above the rest of the audience, pointing to Spirits Rejoice, performing at the Wilson Stadium in the then PE, now of course Triberga. We're seeing the late Sipho Gumede. Just extraordinary to again remind ourselves that this music had a living, live set of spaces outside the mainstream venues in this country. And so what I wrote in this catalog to accompany these images is the following, and that's really just to say that I was struck by the ways in which, although these photographs came from Lulu, that this wasn't a professional portfolio. It was like an intimate family photo album, and there was family of descent. In other words, Lulu's blood family, but there was also musical family, and it was a world in which modernity and urban style coexisted with images of imisebenzi and other rituals in a completely seamless and comfortable way. And so it documented for me how New Brighton, which is, I think, a place that still needs to be given its due when we tell the story of jazz in South Africa, how it was so much more than its kind of designated space, right? And basically it was designed as a labor compound on the fringes of an industrial area, on the periphery of a provincial port city. And yet from this space, we have this extraordinary music that Zim and others have brought to us. And as I wrote here, transmitted across the ether in broadcasts initially meant for other ears, or sometimes clandestinely procured from visiting sailors at the harbor, jazz was studiously absorbed and kind of woven into this distinct African style and identity. Lulu described it to me as a thinking environment in which he grew up. And I felt at that point reminded of something Zim had said to me just about this music never being reducible to apartheid's ethnic cubicles. And I think what McCoy also spoke about, his ability to absorb elements into what he made, was both seamless and completely open to any influence. And so the final quote I'd like to share is that more than just providing a soundtrack for leisure or even important socio-political events, I think jazz can be appreciated with reference to what it's rendered imaginable and also what it's helped to overcome artistically and socially and politically. Of course, in the context of really determined attempts to limit the scope and the ambition of Black life in South Africa. And so as Lulu was to describe it, music was a traveling space for him that brought movement and creativity and a degree of transcendence to people who were rarely being consigned to incredibly subordinate roles in society. And so it's a story that I think merits retelling when we speak about figures like Zim. And the final quote that I shared was something that Lulu, I thought, said that was very significant to me. That growing up in New Brighton, it was not jazz to play only. These are his exact words. It was how to be a human being and to learn to stand on your own. And that's what becoming a jazz musician meant for Lulu, and I believe that's what it meant for Zim as well. And so I'm really honored to be able to share those images with you. And with that, then, I'm going to hand over to our next speaker, and that's Busiso Mashilwane. Mash, lovely to have you with us. Please take the conversation in any direction you'd like to.
Yeah, greetings to everyone. Zim Ngqawana. It's an honor to be here and to kind of participate in this conversation about the great teacher. And also just briefly looking at these pictures that you are sharing, Brett, they mean a lot, you know, as also the video that Darius shared. I met Brazil, I think it must have been 2004, because we were at the Natal Tech then, but Brazil was coming to teach at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So I met Brazil through the excitement of his, who happened later to be his students, Ayanda Sikade and Leon, Leon Shanik. So I met him through those two guys, because me and Duduzo and all the guys were at the Natal Tech, and Ayanda and Leon were at the university. So they were excited when I met them that, hey, there's gonna be, Brazil is coming, you know, is coming to teach us at the university, you know. So they had that excitement, you know. And for me, then I was mobile most of the time, so I had a car. So I was helping them prepare the place for Brazil to stay. This was South Beach in Durban, you know, painting the flats, you know, where it's gonna. So I was like in that midst, you know, of excitement that I think there's someone that is coming to teach, you know, looking from Andile and Sikade, who were my seniors, you know. So that's how I met Brazil, and Brazil had this. He never taught me formally, you know, but like they say, the most effective lessons are the ones that are informal, you know, just his presence, driving him around, taking him to shops to buy things for his flat, you know. For me, that was already a lesson, because I remember by then a new album of Branford Marcellus Love Supreme, you know, had come out, and then he was helping us analyze it and check it out, you know, like what it really means and the gaps that are in the album itself, you know. So I ate with Brazil. I drove Brazil around, and one day he came to me. I was at the practice room after hearing that I actually had a bad gig. So I told him. So he comes to this, you know, he's like big, you know, it's like, oh man, I heard that you had a bad gig. What's going on? What's wrong with you? You know? And I told him, hey, Brazil, it's nerves. Or actually, he said it in Xhosa. It was like, hey man, in the villa, who pitches in the pie? You know, I don't know what that is, you know. But I knew that he meant that I didn't do well. And then I told him it was nerves. You know, it's like I couldn't play. And then he was like, no man, you need to free yourself. You need to learn to be a free thinker and have a kind of a way of free expression, you know, when you're there, when you're on stage. So he kind of had told me all those things informally, you know, which is what Brazil was about, you know, freeing us, you know, as a people, because Brazil was coming from the same communities that we come from, you know. So he knew our struggles. So when he came, he had that thing that, man, first, let's sort out the mentality, you know, free yourself first before you even touch the instrument, you know, go to the instrument knowing that you're going to do something and you're going to impart something, you know. So he kind of had that understanding about us, you know. Unfortunately, it didn't get through with the learning curriculum with the university and the Natal Tech, because then it was like kind of studying the merge, you know, because I remember the horn players that he was teaching, you know, he was not teaching them scales, you know, he was like blow. He was teaching them in a way that was like making them kind of restore a sense of identity in them, you know, for me personally, it was like reviving the reason for me to come to learning, or to come to the college to learn music, because it was the music that I've been hearing in the village. It was part of the culture that was existent in the village, So for him to tell me to play, it was like, and for me to actually see him telling the other guys that they must exist, they must be themselves, and they must be free thinkers. They are already intelligent, and they already have the fact that they're carrying instruments. He was restoring to them that they already are in it, So he was like that to me. And thinking quickly about his legacy, I think he brought his culture, his community, his culture, his language to the dialogue, which is a huge contribution in the definition of South African jazz. For me, one of the ways to document our legends, not only Brazil, I think we need to probably include them, to include their works in our teaching and learning of South African jazz, which is what I think Brazil was all about. It's about the inclusion of our communities in the systems or in the establishment of the universities, particularly in the teaching of jazz.
Thank you so much, Mash. That's really powerful, and it's a fantastic link to our next speaker, who is showing you thumbs up, and like Darius and myself, straddles this world of the academic space and really recognizing and valuing the extraordinary capacity of this music to challenge that space. So I'm delighted to welcome Salim Washington, who's got up really early in New York City to be with us. Salim, would you like to pick up where Mash left off?
Yes, I would. I really enjoyed what you said, Mash. I've enjoyed all the speakers thus far and have learned a lot from it. My thinking, I think, dovetails very nicely with what Mash is saying, because I feel a little bit at a disadvantage because I never got to meet Zim. We are peers. He was born a year after me. And when I got the Fulbright Fellowship, I knew I was coming to study South African jazz at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And I very much wanted to meet him and Becky and Mselebi. And unfortunately, our paths did not cross. But in my preparation for coming to South Africa, I listened to a lot of Zim's music. And for me, it was an experience that brought to mind the experience of listening to the Brotherhood of Breath back in the 1970s. So in the 70s, I was a teenager, and we were studying the music of Zim Ngqawana and Chris McGregor and Mongezi Feza, and we copied their arrangements. Interestingly, I was in Detroit, where the clip was from, and we had a band that was dedicated to this music and to the music of Sun Ra, right? We felt that this was very important. And the thing about it at the time is that as an American jazz musician, you have this notion that New York is the center of the universe, and that other people play jazz, but for hip jazz, and jazz in one part of it is about being hip and all of the cultural resonance that term reverberates. There are very few places on the planet where this is happening, where people are just copying and not innovating, or they're innovating but they can't swing. And these are the two kind of pet peeves as an American musician that you can bring, the kind of prejudice that you can bring to listening. Well, someone like Zim explodes that completely, right? Because he's very hip and he's very innovative, and he's very much within the tradition. Even if he defines his music against that tradition, this notion that jazz is dead, And jazz has been officially dead since it came on the international scene. Every generation says it's dead, even those who are its greatest practitioners. So I think of Zim more as a conceptualist than I do as a saxophonist, as a fellow saxophonist. And this is kind of like an analogous figure might be Ornette Coleman, whom he was compared to before. So Ornette Coleman is one of the indispensable innovators of the music, right? You can't be hip and be ignorant about what he brought to the music. But no one would accuse Ornette Coleman of being a saxophone master in the way that, say, Sonny Stitt is, or the way that George Coleman is, to pick someone who's still alive. This is a different type of mastery. So it's interesting that he studied at UMass with Max Roach, and also Roland Wiggins was there. Also, Brother Yusef Lateef was there. And all of these musicians, in addition to being virtuosos on their instruments and within the tradition, are conceptual thinkers, are philosophical thinkers. And it's really probably a great thing that Zim spent time in that context as one more of these communities. He had the New Brighton community. He has the South African community. He also had this philosophical kind of Afrocentric, if you will, community in UMass at the time, which was a kind of maverick program in a way. So it reminds me in the way of what Darius achieved at UKZN by bringing in people who were within the jazz culture as opposed to the traditional kind of set of students, but a group of people who were really in the culture and trying to propel themselves in a certain kind of way. So UMass was similar to what Mr. Brubeck achieved there, in a sense. So for me, Zim's music was mysterious in a way because it was new and fresh. It didn't sound like this person. It didn't sound like that person, right? I don't think of him as the legacy of Duke Makazi or Barney Rachabani. I think of him as an original thinker who had a closer influence in how he interpreted what jazz was. And so it was interesting because I remember a particular moment that kind of crystallized this for me. We were playing at the Chairman in Durban, a jazz gig. And I love playing the Chairman because it's the only place in Durban that reminds me of New York, you know, because for one thing, the gig starts at 11 p.m. You know, in Durban, people are in bed at 11 p.m. So this already is a certain kind of jazz culture. So there we are doing our thing, trying to play the best that we can. And this civilian asked to come and sing. She wasn't known to me as part of the Durban jazz scene, but she had a beautiful, powerful voice. And she came and she sang and she transformed that club. Everybody was in the spirit, let's say. I won't go so far as to say the Holy Ghost came, but maybe the Holy Ghost did come because we were galvanized, musicians and audience alike. And then Leon, whom Ash has mentioned, he was on the gig, Leon Sharnick, very fine saxophonist in Durban. And we had been having a conversation about what was Zim's true contribution to the music. And he pointed to me and he said, that song that she sang is by Zim. That's what he brings to the table. And so there is a kind of spiritual potency in his music that goes beyond scales and theoretical kind of constructs about what music is. Again, I'm reminded of Ornette Coleman, who divided the jazz community, right? You loved him or you didn't have great love for him, but he was significant. Even his detractors had to admit that this was something new, this was something fresh, that this was a perspective that couldn't be ignored. And I think that Zim Ngqawana also brings to the table that South Africa has a unique relationship to this music that we call jazz. It is unique, of course, because South Africa is unique, but it has so much in common with African American, so much in common, right? So whereas you had in the rest of the African continent 6 or 7 decades of colonial oppression, in South Africa you have 4 centuries of settler colonialism. That's quite different from what happened in most of the continent. In the United States, African Americans came as slaves and also endured 4 centuries of settler colonialism. So the reason that jazz was invented, or the reason that the communities developed this way of speaking to their humanity, this way of speaking to their artistic and aesthetic philosophies, are quite similar, right? There are people who are raised in ultra-modern civilizations, which are racialized, according to apartheid, called Jim Crow in the United States, apartheid in South Africa, and that you have these strategies for keeping a hold of your humanity, not just keeping a hold of it, but propagating a particular view of what it means to be a Black person in the modern world. How do Black people enter modernity? Well, African Americans enter modernity through slavery on a ship, lying in their feces, right? How does Black South Africa enter modernity, right? Under oppressive conditions. And so this music is always about freedom on some level. It is always about humanity on some level. It is always about transcendence, about being one's highest self under a certain type of restriction, right? It's not unfettered license to do whatever you want, but freedom is the goal. But freedom from the point of view of the subaltern is different from the notion of freedom from the point of view of the oppressor. So for me, Zim was really important because he put a very kind of postmodern view on what jazz could be in South Africa and in the world. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Salim. I feel the spirit moving in what you're saying as well, because of how many really profound, intersections you've emphasized.
Thank you.
I think this is the right time to go to Sarah. And Sarah, you shared a journey with Zim on so many levels. We're honored that you're with us today. We're grateful that the Zimology Institute can be represented in this conversation. Please, over to you.
Thank you. And I think thanks to everybody that continues in all over the world and not just in South Africa to keep the memory, the music, and the philosophy of Zim alive. And that's across the world globally. And also just to say appreciate and to recognize and acknowledge all the musicians that have passed and their contributions that they've made to society as a whole. I'd like to share a couple of personal stories. I think thanks for Darius and both for you for raising Lulu and Zim. The two were inseparable. We wouldn't go to bed until Lulu and Zim had a conversation and a debriefing every single night until Lulu's passing. So that just shows the connection. And one other thing that Zim also liked to do was cook a Christmas turkey with Lulu. So that was their little tradition. It was the only night Zim cooked everything from the start to the finish for Christmas with Lulu there. One of the other things that I'd also like to acknowledge is that in the Western Cape with Abdullah Ibrahim, he also then, just building on that, learned a lot about, not learned, but incorporated and also then challenged. So every part of the philosophy and new work he encountered, he'd integrate it and then challenge it and try and dismiss it and make it his own. And that was an amazing thing. And that just ties up to the thinking that we spoke about earlier on. And a lot of his concerts came from the experience also just being with Abdullah and realizing that actually there can be some level of silence and appreciation and shifting the culture of appreciating music. The other thing that is also, so he read a lot, he engaged a lot, and he criticized and then internalized. And if you look at all the albums that he's done, he's incorporated artists, poets, and he embraced things so that it's more than just music. So creativity was important. And then the whole aspect of breath. And, when he's also made one movie, which was when the piano was vandalized on the farm at Johannesburg. And Aryan did an amazing piece documenting that, Aryan Karganov. And then some of this earlier music was also used in local films and then also in dance exhibitions where people used music in which to interpret the music through dance. So the impact has been fairly widespread. I want to link this both to the film festival and the diversity. So it wasn't just one thing in terms of music, but I think that the film festival, film, art, can play a role in documenting, but also archiving in a different manner all the information that we have, not just of Zim, but all of the musicians within the country. And I think that's where the link to the film festival for me is key. Another key thing also to just point out, 10 years ago was we had with Madiba's inauguration, that was when Zim did the 100 drum ensemble. And he was able to pull together the most amazing people that some did interaction with music, but not all at the same level. So his ability to pull together people from diverse experience, culture, and also just talk about things. And a lot of the students or the people that have interacted will say, we thought we were getting a lecture, what we got was silence. So it depends on at which stage of life you met Zim. And each of those experiences give you a completely different experience because you think, oh, was that the same person? Because as he learned and as he developed, he kind of integrated, grew, and changed. And so I think, and we always worked in kind of 5-year plans. So what I want to tell all musicians and all artists, please get your finances and get your things in a row. Do not leave the rest of us to deal with this on your passing, no matter how wonderful you are as an artist. It's taken me this time to deal with some of so there's an imbalance. And I think that's part of why I'm only pulling together things now. And that's part of my healing process, but also it's time to now pull together all things Zim. And there is music that he still hasn't released. There's a lot I don't know of, but those that I do know of, this is the year we're going to start releasing some of those things and just share. And I think the legacy that he leaves is different in everybody. And I think that is the most amazing thing. Whether it's a musician, whether it's an artist, whether it's just the cashier in a local shop, he's interacted and he's human and he's not perfect, but it's the music that we focus on. And I think within this film festival, both at UKZN, which has a history and a home for Zim, and had given him a lot of opportunities, I think it's important for us to then take both the music and how we document music in more than one media or one platform. There's currently quite a few articles and academic research happening around Zim's life and aspects of his life, aspects of his music that's happening at the various universities. And I'm hoping that we can pull these things together on a platform and in that way, not only enrich the music, but also the academic contribution that's analyzed through different lenses. And I'm hoping that through film, we can also start a process of documenting both those people, all the musicians that are currently practicing, the people that we recognize, McCoy, Lex, Faya. You can't name them all, but everybody that's been associated, to just build them. And I think, so for me, it's not just about the 10 years past, but what can we do in the 10 years forward to transform, transmute, and ensure that within our children's exposure to music, they can encounter their parents, their friends. So that photograph that Brett shared with everybody in the township, for me, should be permeating every aspect of society, whether it's the social media, this is where we need to uplift, build, and transform. And the responsibility of that sits with our generation and the generation that follows. And I think I'll stop there for now, Brett.
That's a really wonderful call to action, Sarah, but thank you for what you're doing to gather these materials and to take this incredible legacy into the future. So everyone who's on the panel has had an initial opportunity to speak. I'd like to welcome everyone who's tuning into this webinar and offer anyone who'd like to ask a question or offer a comment to please put that in the chat, and we'd love to engage with that. But if I can maybe take up the really wonderful challenge you give us at this time, Sarah, and it connects with this theme that Darius and Mash and Salim have spoken to, and that is the challenge that Zim brought to the university and how engaging with this tradition both can serve this legacy but also can kind of shake up the institutions in a productive way. I'm interested that you referred back, Sarah, to Zim's appreciation for listening audiences. And in fact, that's what first connected me with Zim, because he liked playing in theaters and not in bars. And that was in part because of his religious commitments, but in part that he really valued the space for attentive listening that a theater and by extension, a university environment can provide. So Zim valued that kind of structure and attention, even though he very aptly chafed against the constrictions of a formal curriculum and teaching becoming a job and that sort of thing. And I think having the Zimology Institute as an active participant in this conversation today reopens for us this question of what kinds of spaces for learning and knowledge creation we can create within and beyond formal academic institutions to precisely, recognize the importance of this music in communities and particularly in the subaltern communities that Salim was referring to. Would anyone like to speak to that? But if anyone wants to pick up another comment, I'll keep an eye on the chat. I'm not seeing any new questions yet, but it seems this is an important part of the call to action in responding to Zim's legacy. Please, Darius. And McCoy, oh, McCoy's hand is up, and then let's go to Darius after McCoy. McCoy. If you can just unmute, please.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'd like to add that Zim helped to shape our music, not necessarily jazz. What I was trying when I started, my first recording, I didn't write a single song, A talent scout just loved my tone, just loved the way I played, in 1988. And I was still finding my ground in Johannesburg, just over being here for a year. And he gave me a recording deal. Paul Helmer wrote the music, and the late Jabu Nkosi. While I was, finding my ground, like I said. So my next recording came, 9 years later, Tears of Joy. And Zim was over the moon that I recorded Tete Mbambiza's Umsenge, because we had many conversations of trying to create our own jazz standards and taking old songs and revive them, And Zim took it to another level. I mean, song Ebo Follow, the stuff he did, taking, folk songs and incorporating into his music, Kula Kwedini, the songs that we had as children, Zim really shaped it, It kind of reminded me of Coltrane taking Green Sleeves, my favorite things, So Zim was something else. And doing the modal thing and the close-up pentatonics, So I hear many Zim's elements in these young kids that are coming up, which is beautiful, So I thank him really for taking our music to the next level, to a bigger one. Yeah, that's my beat for now. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Darius?
Sorry, I was just stuck on mute for a moment. Okay. I think there's a remarkable tapestry of agreement emerging from this. I feel like we're all kind of sitting around a table, even though we aren't. And I'm glad this is being recorded because there are some programmatic things going forward. I'm retired. I don't have to make it happen, but I know there's many younger people in the field that can make it happen. All I can do is impart what I was trying for is being talked about in a more mature way. It's less of an experiment. A lot of things have happened since the 80s. What we did do, we brought Alan Kwela and Sandile Shange on the campus teaching guitar. Ezra Ngqawana, Barney Rachabani, Winston Mangunku, wonderful stories about all of these workshops. But the striking thing is that these were all extracurricular. And nowadays, those events should be centralized in the curriculum and wherever the teaching space is. And maybe the extracurricular thing is play a B major 7th arpeggio. Oh, got that? Good. And the next big event in the structure of education. This is kind of what I was pushing, but of course that couldn't be the official line. And I'm not saying anyone is being pushed aside, victimized, downplayed, but there is a certain kind of academic structure. And every time a discussion like this would come up, I would be reminded by someone who was not necessarily unfriendly by any means, as I would have to remind students, there is such a thing as a degree. And you either meet those criteria or you don't. It doesn't shut down other possibilities. And I have a lot of respect for that point of view if you're talking about engineering, because engineering degrees on the basis of zymology might mean highway bridges falling down, but not music, not any of the arts. And I gave you that laundry list, not laundry list, but list of distinguished names. It comes back a little bit toward the documentary question, because all the students who were exposed to Alan, Sandy, Ezra, Barney, Winston, Stompy Manana, you even had his moments there. They'll have a memory of being, close to someone famous and great, but it won't have fit into what they would regard as the structure of their education. So it's a very individual thing, whether they really took all they could get from those opportunities. Oh, Brock, you did a very good workshop on campus. Joseph Shabalala, okay, a little beside, was a fellow at the Center for Jazz and Popular Music. That was what kind of justified the popular music side. About documentation, it is very hard to see archives and documentation really develop outside of an academic environment. Whose job is it to index and cross-index and reference and put things on shelves, or these days online? It is difficult. My family has quite a lot of experience in that area with the Brubeck collection that's now in the library of our hometown. You need professional input to make this happen. You need government grants. This should be the first priority of any kind of South African Arts Council worthy of the name, I should think. There's two things about, it sounds like I'm making a speech. I guess I am. There's two things about documentation. One is just get all the footage you can. McCoy and I had this discussion a little bit on Radio Metro. You don't decide in advance who a legend is. That's in the rear view mirror by definition. The other thing, and McCoy I think of as kind of a pioneer in this, is musicians themselves can do an awful lot. Now, back in the day, I remember personally being on stage with Zim or Duke Makazi, especially Barney, all of them would really come close to freaking out if they saw some well-intentioned soul with a stupid Walkman with a microphone that big, or a camera, or it was all this suspicion and paranoia, which came from two things. It came from a history of exploitation, which genuinely did happen. It also came from a certain naivete about how much money do people really make from selling records. Well, McCoy and I have been doing it all our lives. We can tell you it is not the road to riches. Even for an exploiter, right? You don't suddenly become Sting or Beyonce, especially via, sort of non-studio apparatus. I think this attitude is changing because, to use a slightly theoretical Marxist term, the means of production are in our hands now. You can produce an album on a laptop. The most expensive gear that you need are the microphones. Maybe you need to, I don't want to go down to the level of practical advice, but you can get that advice. You can work with people. You can have cooperative relationships with the people who want to document you instead of getting angry. And I understand their anger. It's like you feel you're losing control of the only thing you have. It's your performance, your image, your identity, your sound. But that's an out-of-date attitude. That was when only well-funded people could make videos. Studio recordings were usually much better than live recordings. All of that's in the past. You know, we're talking about fax machines versus the internet. You know, it's primitive technology, and that instilled a mindset that we can't do a lot of it ourselves or cooperatively with friends who possess those means. So, you know, I think we all have a duty to encourage rather than discourage documentation. And those of us who have some kind of political or academic interface to index, catalog, house, do all of that. It's important to keep making that point over and over again, including about things that aren't necessarily thought of as important at the time. Because they, you know, in retrospect, I mean, who wouldn't want, you know, Bra Allen playing solo guitar and making his wry and sometimes very penetrating, angry comments? Who wouldn't want that? Well, the only person who didn't at the time was Allen, but you get my point. I guess I've gone on for long enough, but I love the way we're all on the same side. We're all trying to build this kind of integral texture of using some academic slang. Now we're really talking about practice-based pedagogy, and we're talking about a living archive. Okay.
Thanks, Darius. I just wanted to add, thanks, Darius. And I think, you know, I'm glad McCoy is here, because I think McCoy, yes, he's a pioneer, and he's not only a pioneer, McCoy is you were a diligent practitioner, and he captures. He's got a plan. But for me, it's these kind of things. So what you spoke about initially, yes, just shows the evolution of the resistance and the transition to the new. And that is part of the evolution. And I think where the link with film comes in is we need the films to capture the how-tos. We need the documents. We need people like me not to be stuck, to be able to say, actually, you're the widow, here's a how-to guide. Step 1, do this. Step 2, do that. Those are the gaps that we have in society, because there's a wealth of information that family has that can add value to the multiple perspectives and of all musicians and their legacies. And it's not just about legends. I think it's about the history, the culture, and the message, and strengthening what we have as a country. And so I applaud McCoy, because he diligently records or gets his archive. So he's way ahead of Zim when it comes to these things. So maybe you can share some more things, McCoy.
Please unmute McCoy. It sounds great. We'd love to hear you.
Okay. No. I've said my piece here. I'm looking at the time. Yeah. Salim, Professor Mesh.
I think what we're hearing is that there's a freedom now to really take ownership of this process. And it's fantastic that it's the artists themselves and the people closest to them who can be driving this process. Mesh, please come in.
Yeah, thank you very much, Babu Darius and Bob McCoy. Yeah, I just started now my career, which is like 2016, you know, intuitively. So I started recording stuff intuitively. You know, I didn't know what I was doing, like making archives and all sorts, you know. So it's only now that I see the importance, you know. Actually, I saw the importance now during the lockdown that actually what I was doing is needed now. People need to see videos and all sorts, you know, which is, I think, I now I started actually talking to my students about the importance of recording everything that they do, even when they think that it's not important themselves. They can do. I mean, we're carrying smartphones in our days, and most of the phones that we carry are they carry the same quality, which is like 4K resolution. However, I know that the university. At the university, there is or during performances or recitals, there were like videos taken intentionally for archiving, you know. So I wonder if that happens to all the universities, you know. Secondly, as a solution to this, I think we need to. Well, I'm young enough to say this, but I think we need to hold our financial resources, so far it's just been arts and culture, to be accountable in helping us. You know, for example, I heard this morning Babu Natim Teta talking about billions that are spent on artists. And I'm asking myself, who are these artists? You know, I'm just innocent. It's an innocent question. I'm just asking, who are these artists that the billions are going to, you know? And recently, I went to Cape Town and I met Babu Tete Mbabisa, you know, and we were talking about all these things. And I'm like, we need funds to do these things, you know. This thing must be done intentionally, you know, and it must be part of the budget from the arts and culture, you know, and from our institutions. Those that are not probably doing recording this stuff, I think they probably need to start budgeting towards recording their performances, you know, or their students' recitals, you know. So it starts from the arts and culture. They've got a lot of money. They must put the budget. We must hold them accountable. I'm young enough. I think I still have the energy to talk about this, you know, and then to our university and also to us as musicians is to take every single gig seriously and record. I mean, recently, each and every like for myself, each and every interview, including this one, I'm recording this conversation myself. It's my responsibility, you know. And whenever I do interviews, Metro FM, Kaya FM, you know, Sis Brenda, actually, I was doing a live interview with her. It's like, I came in with my phone and stand. You know, it's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I have to record this, you know. So I think it's a responsibility for everyone. Thank you.
Our webinar ends precisely at 11:30, so the last word will need to go to Salim. Over to you, please.
Yes, I appreciate what you're saying, Mass, but I'm not that sanguine about putting the responsibility in the hands of the government. I think that this music has always been an underground thing, and that if it's going to be preserved the way we want it preserved, we're going to have to do it. I'm encouraged by Mthunzi Mvubu's series of interviews that he did with musicians. It was from the point of view of a young practitioner, and I think there's value in that. I'm not saying let's not seek official funding. I'm saying let's not depend upon it. We might be sorely disappointed if we do.
Thank you so much, colleagues, for this call to action, which I think is very much inspired by Zim's life and work. Salim, Darius, McCoy, Sarah, and Mash, thank you so much. Thanks to Diff and to everyone who helped put together this wonderful conversation. And we look forward to taking the legacy forward. Thank you, everyone. We'll adjourn now.
Thank you.